The storm raged, wind howling through the empty streets. A lone dog, ribs jutting out from hunger, lay curled beneath a crumbling alleyway. Until a stranger appeared, a man in a tailored suit. He knelt, offering food. What followed was unforgettable. The rain had a way of swallowing sound, turning the city into a ghost of blurred neon reflections and whispering water. It was the kind of night that made everything feel smaller, pressed beneath the weight of darkened clouds. A lone figure moved through the streets, his polished shoes cutting through the puddles, barely making a sound against the cacophony of storm drains and distant sirens. Elijah Davenport had spent his life believing in numbers, the cold, hard certainty of wealth, investments, and the empire he built from nothing. There was no room for emotions in business. Empathy was a weakness, one that had cost him in the past. Yet that night, something made him pause. A flicker of movement caught his eye, a shape curled into the shadows beneath the awning of a shuttered bakery. At first, it looked like nothing more than discarded rags left behind by the wind. But then the rags moved. A dog, thin beyond belief, its ribs pressing through damp fur, its body shuddering with the effort of breathing. Elijah frowned. The city was filled with strays, creatures left to fend for themselves just as people did. But there was something different about this one. It wasn't just hunger or the quiet whimpers barely audible beneath the storm. It was its eyes, hollow, searching, waiting for something it had long stopped expecting. Kindness. For reasons Elijah couldn't explain, he knelt down. His expensive suit was soaked in seconds, but he hardly noticed. He reached into the paper bag he carried, the remnants of a dinner he had barely touched. A simple meal, forgotten in the chaos of a business meeting that had gone on too long. He placed the food down. The dog hesitated, its shrunken frame recoiling slightly as if it expected cruelty rather than mercy. Elijah watched, waiting. A minute passed, then another. Finally, the animal crept forward, sniffing the air cautiously before sinking its teeth into the meal, devouring it in desperate, trembling bites. A strange sensation curled inside Elijah's chest, foreign and unwelcome. Pity? Number something deeper, something he had buried long ago. Lightning split the sky, and for a brief second, the entire street was illuminated. That's when Elijah saw it, something that made his breath catch. The dog wasn't alone. Just beyond the reach of the awning, nearly invisible in the downpour, a child stood watching. Barefoot, drenched, silent. Their hair plastered to their forehead, eyes locked on Elijah with the same hollow waiting stare as the dog. For the first time in years, Elijah felt truly unmoored. His world, built on logic and order, tilted on its axis. Because no matter how ruthless a man he had become, no matter how much he had distanced himself from the past, he could not walk away from this. Elijah Davenport was not a man easily shaken. Decades in the world of high-stakes business had made him immune to sentimentality. Yet, as he knelt there in the rain, the child's hollow gaze carved into something long buried inside him. The child did not move, only watched. Their frail frame trembled, a mixture of cold and wariness. Elijah had seen that kind of fear before, the kind that came from expecting disappointment, the kind that came from learning too young that people turned away more often than they reached out. He swallowed, the weight of the moment pressing against his ribs. He had a choice. He could walk away, pretend he had never seen the child, let someone else bear the burden of their existence. It would be easier, cleaner. But for the first time in years, easy didn't sit right with him. The rain had a way of swallowing sound, turning the city into a ghost of blurred neon reflections and whispering water. It was the kind of night that made everything feel smaller, pressed beneath the weight of darkened clouds. A lone figure moved through the streets, his polished shoes cutting through the puddles, barely making a sound against the cacophony of storm drains and distant sirens. Elijah Davenport had spent his life believing in numbers, the cold, hard certainty of wealth, investments, and the empire he built from nothing. There was no room for emotions in business. Empathy was a weakness, one that had cost him in the past. Yet that night, something made him pause. A flicker of movement caught his eye, a shape curled into the shadows beneath the awning of a shuttered bakery. At first, it looked like nothing more than discarded rags left behind by the wind. But then the rags moved. A dog, thin beyond belief, its ribs pressing through damp fur, its body shuddering with the effort of breathing. Elijah frowned. The city was filled with strays, creatures left to fend for themselves just as people did. But there was something different about this one. It wasn't just hunger or the quiet whimpers barely audible beneath the storm. It was its eyes, hollow, searching, waiting for something it had long stopped expecting. Kindness. For reasons Elijah couldn't explain, he knelt down. His expensive suit was soaked in seconds, but he hardly noticed. He reached into the paper bag he carried, the remnants of a dinner he had barely touched. A simple meal, forgotten in the chaos of a business meeting that had gone on too long. He placed the food down. The dog hesitated, its shrunken frame recoiling slightly as if it expected cruelty rather than mercy. Elijah watched, waiting. A minute passed, then another. Finally, the animal crept forward, sniffing the air cautiously before sinking its teeth into the meal, devouring it in desperate, trembling bites. A strange sensation curled inside Elijah's chest, foreign and unwelcome. Pity? Number something deeper, something he had buried long ago. Lightning split the sky, and for a brief second, the entire street was illuminated. That's when Elijah saw it, something that made his breath catch. The dog wasn't alone. Just beyond the reach of the awning, nearly invisible in the downpour, a child stood watching. Barefoot, drenched, silent. Their hair plastered to their forehead, eyes locked on Elijah with the same hollow waiting stare as the dog. For the first time in years, Elijah felt truly unmoored. His world, built on logic and order, tilted on its axis. Because no matter how ruthless a man he had become, no matter how much he had distanced himself from the past, he could not walk away from this. Elijah Davenport was not a man easily shaken. Decades in the world of high-stakes business had made him immune to sentimentality. Yet, as he knelt there in the rain, the child's hollow gaze carved into something long buried inside him. The child did not move, only watched. Their frail frame trembled, a mixture of cold and wariness. Elijah had seen that kind of fear before, the kind that came from expecting disappointment, the kind that came from learning too young that people turned away more often than they reached out. He swallowed, the weight of the moment pressing against his ribs. He had a choice. He could walk away, pretend he had never seen the child, let someone else bear the burden of their existence. It would be easier, cleaner. But for the first time in years, easy didn't sit right with him. The city stretched in endless steel and glass reflections, a cold monument to progress and power. Elijah Davenport had built his empire here, his life meticulously planned and calculated. But tonight, as he sat in the back of his chauffeured car, his thoughts were far from boardrooms and balance sheets. The image of the child, drenched and silent, gnawed at him. He had offered money, a coat, a direction to follow. But was it enough? Logic dictated that he had done more than most, that the child's fate was not his burden to carry. And yet, for the first time in years, he found himself questioning the clean simplicity of that detachment. He exhaled, pressing 2 fingers against his temple. "Turn around," he said abruptly. His driver, Marcus, glanced at him through the rearview mirror, but didn't hesitate. The car glided through the rain-slicked streets, retracing their route. When they arrived at the bakery's awning, Elijah peered through the window, expecting to see the small, shivering figure huddled there. But the child was gone. A sharp pang shot through his chest. Annoyance or guilt, he wasn't sure which. His gaze swept the street, searching the shadows. That's when he saw it. Near the entrance of an alley, half hidden behind an overflowing dumpster, a tattered piece of fabric fluttered. The coat he had given the child. His pulse quickened. Elijah stepped out of the car, the night air biting against his skin. He approached the coat, now discarded and damp, a stark contrast to the gratitude he had expected. Why would they leave it behind? Then, from deeper within the alley, a sound, a muffled scuffle. He moved forward, careful, his polished shoes sinking into the damp grime. Further in, barely visible under the dim light of a flickering street lamp, He saw them. Two figures. One, unmistakably the child. The other, a man looming over them, gripping the child's arm too tightly. Elijah felt something cold coil in his stomach. He had seen many deals made in dark corners, many desperate exchanges. But this was different. This was wrong. Without thinking, he strode forward. "Hey!" The man's head snapped up, his expression shifting from predatory control to wary aggression. The child froze, wide-eyed, their small frame locked in the man's grasp. Elijah took another step, his voice even but firm. "Let them go." The man smirked. "Mind your business, rich boy." Elijah's jaw clenched. He had been called many things, had faced boardroom battles where fortunes were at stake. But this was not a negotiation. This was something far more primal. Then the child did something unexpected. They yanked free, small, swift, desperate. And in their haste, they stumbled backward, their foot catching the edge of a broken crate. Elijah lunged forward, catching them before they could hit the ground. The man cursed under his breath and took a step back, assessing the new odds. He eyed Elijah's tailored suit, the expensive watch on his wrist. Calculating. Then, without another word, he turned and melted into the night. Elijah exhaled slowly, lowering the child to their feet. "Are you all right?" he asked. But they didn't answer. Their breath came in sharp, uneven gasps, their wide eyes locked onto his as if unsure whether he was a new threat or a savior. The storm raged on, and for the first time in years, Elijah had no clear next move. The rain pounded harder, drumming against the city streets as Elijah knelt before the child, waiting for an answer that wouldn't come. Their small frame trembled, their breath still ragged from the encounter. The child's eyes flicked to the alley's mouth, as if expecting the man to return. Elijah followed their gaze, his own mind racing. He knew what fear looked like, what desperation felt like when all options had run dry. He sighed, straightening. "Come on," he said, more of an invitation than a command. The child hesitated, but after a moment, nodded. Marcus had already stepped out of the car, holding the back door open. The child climbed in cautiously, their small hands gripping the edge of the leather seat as though ready to flee at any moment. Elijah slid in beside them, closing the door with a quiet finality. The car moved forward, merging into the city's heartbeat once more. For several minutes, neither spoke. The child sat stiffly, their eyes flickering between Elijah and the passing lights outside. Elijah let the silence stretch, sensing that pressing too soon would only push them further into their shell. Finally, he said, "What's your name?" A long pause, then almost too soft to hear. "Sam." Elijah nodded, rolling the name over in his mind. "All right, Sam. Do you have somewhere safe to go?" Sam's hands tightened on the fabric of the too big shirt they wore. No. Elijah should have expected that. He studied the child more closely now, noting the sharp angles of their face, the hollowness beneath their eyes. He had seen this kind of exhaustion before, the kind that came from fighting battles long before you were old enough to understand them. He drummed his fingers against his knee, thinking. He could take them to a shelter, let the system handle it. That was the logical step, the practical solution. But something about the discarded coat, the bruises shadowing Sam's wrists, made logic feel insufficient. "You hungry?" he asked. Sam hesitated, then nodded. Marcus glanced at Elijah through the rearview mirror, silently awaiting instructions. Elijah sighed. "Take us home." Home. The word felt foreign in his mouth. His penthouse was a fortress of sleek design and minimalism, a place built for efficiency rather than comfort. He had never imagined bringing someone like Sam there. But tonight, it seemed, his life was no longer following the script he had so carefully written. When they arrived, Sam hesitated in the doorway, their gaze darting over the gleaming marble floors and towering glass windows. Elijah understood the hesitation. To a child who had spent nights in the rain, this must have seemed like a different world entirely. "It's just a place," he said, shrugging off his jacket. "Come on, the kitchen's this way." Sam followed, their steps light and careful. Elijah moved through the kitchen with practiced efficiency, pulling out leftovers, reheating soup. The space was immaculate, rarely used, designed more for aesthetics than practicality. But tonight, it served a purpose. He set the bowl in front of Sam, watching as they hesitated before finally picking up the spoon. They ate slowly at first, as if waiting for the meal to be snatched away. When it wasn't, they picked up speed, devouring it with quiet urgency. Elijah leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "Who was that man in the alley?" Sam stiffened, their grip on the spoon tightened. "No one." Elijah frowned but didn't push, not yet. Instead, he pulled out a chair and sat across from them. "All right, Sam, here's the deal. You can stay here tonight. No strings. Tomorrow we figure out what comes next." Sam looked up, their expression unreadable. "Why are you helping me?" Elijah didn't have an answer that made sense, so he settled for the truth. "Because I couldn't walk away." Sam studied him for a long moment, as if measuring the weight of those words. Then, slowly, they nodded. For the first time in years, Elijah felt something unfamiliar settle in his chest. A beginning. The night felt heavier than before. Inside the penthouse, the rain drummed against the glass, a rhythmic reminder of the world outside. Elijah sat in his study, staring at the untouched glass of whiskey on his desk. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, but his mind was anything but quiet. Sam had been here for 2 nights now. 2 nights of careful glances, of trust being built in the smallest, most fragile ways. But something felt off. He could sense it in the way Sam moved, in the way their eyes darted to the windows as if expecting something, or someone to appear. He hadn't pushed, not yet. But tonight, something in his gut told him it was time. A sharp knock at the study door. "Elijah?" Sam's voice was hesitant, edged with something unreadable. "Come in," he said, his voice steady. Sam stepped inside, their small frame dwarfed by the bookshelves lining the walls. They hesitated near the doorway, shifting their weight from one foot to the other. "Something wrong?" Elijah asked, though he already knew the answer. Sam took a breath, then reached into their pocket, pulling out a crumpled envelope. They held it out, their fingers trembling slightly. "I found this in your mail," they said. It has my name on it." Elijah's heart thudded once, hard against his ribs. He took the envelope, unfolding the damp paper inside. The writing was hurried, almost frantic. "You can't keep running, Sam. He'll find you." A cold wave rushed through Elijah. He looked up, meeting Sam's wide, anxious eyes. "Who sent this?" he asked. Sam shook their head. "I don't know." Elijah's grip tightened on the paper. "Who is looking for you?" Sam swallowed hard, but didn't answer. Instead, their eyes flickered to the window, to the city beyond. And that's when Elijah understood. He stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "Sam!" A sudden crash from outside, the unmistakable sound of glass shattering. Elijah's instincts kicked in. He grabbed Sam, pulling them behind him as he moved swiftly toward the door. His mind raced. Had he been followed? Had Sam? Was it the man from the alley? Another sound, footsteps, fast, unrelenting. Then, the door burst open. The intruder moved with practiced ease, slipping through the broken window like a ghost. Rain and wind howled into the penthouse, scattering papers and sending shadows dancing across the walls. Elijah's mind sharpened to a singular point. Protect Sam. The man stood tall, his hood dripping with rain, his face obscured by the dim light. But his voice, low, cutting, sent an immediate chill through the room. "Sam," he said almost gently, "it's time to go." Sam shrank back, pressing against Elijah's side, and that was all the confirmation he needed. "No," Elijah said, his voice like steel. "You're not taking them anywhere." The man exhaled, almost disappointed. You don't understand what you've stepped into, Davenport. Elijah stiffened. His name. This wasn't random. This was planned. Sam's breathing turned ragged, their hands clenched into fists at their sides. And then, barely above a whisper, "He's my father." The words hit Elijah like a sledgehammer. He turned, searching Sam's face, hoping for some kind of denial. But there was only fear, and something else, something close to shame. "Sam?" His voice was quieter now, struggling to piece together the fractures of reality. The man, Sam's father, took another step forward. "They belong with me." Elijah shook his head, stepping between them. "If that were true, they wouldn't be running from you." Sam's father smiled. "A cruel thing. That's what they told you, isn't it?" His gaze flicked to Sam, something almost amused in his eyes. "Go on. Tell him the truth." Elijah felt the shift in the air before he even understood it. Sam's hands trembled at their sides, their breath coming too fast. "Tell him, Sam." Their father's voice was coaxing, controlled. Elijah looked down at Sam. "Tell me what?" Silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. Then finally Sam spoke. "I lied." Elijah's heart pounded. "About what?" Sam swallowed hard. "About everything." The words felt like a knife to the ribs. Their father stepped closer, watching Elijah with cold amusement. "Now you see. You were never the hero of this story. Just another fool who got in the way." Elijah didn't move, didn't breathe. He looked at Sam, searching for the truth beneath their crumbling facade. And he realized, too late, that he had been wrong about everything. The penthouse had never felt so empty. Elijah stood in the center of the living room, the floor-to-ceiling windows reflecting the distant glow of the city, cold, indifferent, unfeeling. The storm outside had passed, but inside, the wreckage remained. Broken glass still littered the floor where the intruder had entered, and the wind had left damp streaks along the marble. He hadn't bothered to clean it up. He hadn't moved at all. His hands trembled as he reached for the discarded envelope on the table, the one with Sam's name on it. He hadn't read it, couldn't bring himself to. Not after everything. Not after the truth had gutted him where he stood. "I lied." Sam's voice still echoed in his head, fracturing every moment they had shared, every fragile bond that had formed in the quiet spaces between words. He had thought he was saving them, thought he was doing something right for once in his life. And yet, he had been nothing more than another pawn in a game he hadn't even realized he was playing. He sank onto the couch, elbows on his knees, fingers threading into his hair. The weight of it all pressed down on him, suffocating. He had spent a lifetime building walls, against emotion, against attachment, against anything that could make him vulnerable. And in one fleeting moment of misplaced trust, he had let them crumble. Now all that remained was the wreckage. The city stretched beyond the glass, sprawling and endless, but it might as well have been a different world. He had always found comfort in its hum, its constancy. But tonight, it was nothing more than an echo chamber of his own isolation. His phone lay untouched on the coffee table, its screen dark. No calls, no messages. Even Marcus, ever loyal, had given him space. The silence was deafening. He exhaled sharply, pushing to his feet, pacing the length of the room. His reflection followed him in the glass, distorted by the uneven light. He barely recognized himself. The impeccable businessman, the untouchable force in the corporate world. None of that mattered here. None of it could fix what had been broken. His eyes flicked back to the envelope. For a long moment, he just stared at it. Then, slowly, as if afraid of what it might hold, he reached for it. The paper was slightly damp from the storm, the ink smudged in places. He unfolded it with care, his breath catching as he began to read. "Elijah, if you're reading this, it means I couldn't say it to your face. It means I failed in the one thing I wanted to do most. Tell you the truth." His hands clenched the edges of the paper, but he forced himself to keep reading. "I never wanted to lie to you. But I did. Over and over again. Because I was afraid. Because I knew that if you really saw me, saw everything, I'd lose the only thing that had started to feel real. You don't understand yet, but you will. And when you do, I hope you'll forgive me. Sam. The words blurred as his vision swam. He swallowed hard, his throat tightening. Forgive? How could he? How could he erase the betrayal, the doubt, the gnawing, suffocating feeling that he had been played for a fool? He let the letter slip from his fingers, watched as it fluttered to the floor. The walls of the penthouse seemed to close in around him, the vast space suffocating in its emptiness. He had never felt so alone. His gaze drifted to the broken glass, to the shattered remnants of something he couldn't quite name. Perhaps this was what he had been running from all along, not failure, not loss, but the weight of caring, the unbearable ache of connection. Because now that it was gone, now that the illusion had shattered, all he was left with was himself. And he wasn't sure he could bear it. The storm had passed, but Elijah's world remained in upheaval. The letter lay where he had dropped it, its words still heavy in his mind. He had spent his life mastering control, dictating the course of his future with precision. And now? Now he stood at the edge of something unknown, something terrifying. His phone vibrated, an unknown number. He hesitated before answering. Davenport. A voice, quiet but urgent. You need to come now. Sam's in trouble. Elijah's breath stilled. Where? The docks. Warehouse 16. The line went dead. A cold certainty settled in his gut. This wasn't random. It was a reckoning. He grabbed his keys and stormed out. The drive to the docks was a blur of city lights and mounting tension. He could feel it now, his carefully built world fracturing beneath him. But for the first time, he wasn't running from it. When he arrived, the docks stretched before him in eerie silence. Warehouse 16 loomed ahead, its metal walls rusting, its windows dark. Elijah stepped forward, heart pounding. Every instinct screamed caution, but he shoved it aside. This was not the moment for hesitation. A figure emerged from the shadows, Sam's father. I was wondering when you'd show, the man said, voice like gravel. You've been a real problem, Davenport. Elijah's jaw clenched. Where's Sam? The man smirked, tilting his head. Inside. But here's the thing. You don't get to just walk in and take what's mine. Elijah took another step forward. They don't belong to you. The man's smirk faltered. Oh? And they belong to you? Elijah didn't flinch. No one owns them, and I'll make damn sure they never have to run from you again. The air crackled with tension. Then, the man pulled a knife from his coat, its blade catching the dim light. You don't know what you're doing. Elijah had never been one for physical fights, but something inside him had shifted. He wasn't here for negotiations. He was here to end this. When the man lunged, Elijah was ready. The knife slashed through the air, but Elijah dodged, his movements fueled by adrenaline and sheer resolve. He struck out, his fist connecting with the man's ribs, forcing him back. A low chuckle. Not bad, Davenport. Didn't think you had it in you. Elijah wiped the blood from his lip. You don't know me. A flash of movement. The knife came again, slicing just past his shoulder. Elijah retaliated, grabbing the man's wrist, twisting it until the weapon clattered to the ground. A growl of frustration. Then, footsteps from inside the warehouse. Elijah! Sam. The distraction was enough. The man broke free, shoving Elijah back. He scrambled for the knife, but Elijah was faster, kicking it away. You've already lost, Elijah said, breathless. Walk away. The man hesitated. Then, with a sneer, he stepped back into the shadows. This isn't over. Elijah didn't wait to watch him disappear. He turned, pushing into the warehouse. Sam stood there, wide-eyed, bruised but unharmed. Elijah exhaled deeply, his voice softer now. You okay? Sam nodded, but their hands were still shaking. I thought you wouldn't come. He stepped closer. I will always come. A moment of silence. Then, Sam did something they had never done before, They reached out, gripping Elijah's sleeve. For the first time, they believed him. And for the first time, Elijah realized he had finally stopped running from himself. The city had not changed, but Elijah had. The skyline remained an endless stretch of steel and glass, indifferent to his journey. The streets still hummed with hurried footsteps and distant sirens. But the weight he had carried for so long, the one he had never even acknowledged, felt lighter now. He stood outside a small cafe, hands in his coat pockets, watching the people pass by. It was the same cafe where he had once conducted cold, calculated business deals, the place where success had always mattered more than people. But today he wasn't here for business. He stepped inside, the scent of coffee and warm pastries wrapping around him like a quiet embrace. The hum of conversation filled the space, but Elijah wasn't listening. His eyes moved to the far corner of the room, where Sam sat hunched over a notebook, a pencil tapping against the page in thought. They hadn't noticed him yet. A month had passed since the night at the docks, since Elijah had fought for something beyond himself, since he had stood between Sam and their past, and in doing so, had confronted his own. He moved toward their table, but he didn't rush. He had learned that some things couldn't be forced. Sam glanced up, their expression unreadable for a moment. Then a small nod. An invitation. Elijah slid into the seat across from them. "What are you writing?" Sam hesitated, then pushed the notebook toward him. Elijah glanced down. The words weren't finished, but the meaning was clear. A story. One about survival, about change, about finding something when you least expected it. He met Sam's gaze. "You're a writer." A small shrug. "I don't know yet." "You will be." Silence stretched between them, but it was comfortable now, the kind that didn't demand to be filled. Elijah reached into his coat pocket and pulled out an envelope. He placed it on the table. "It's yours." Sam frowned. "What is?" "The apartment. The one you stayed in." He pushed it closer. "It's in your name now." Sam blinked, their hands tightening around the notebook. "Why?" Elijah exhaled. "Because I don't want you to feel like you have to run anymore." A beat of silence, then, so softly Elijah almost didn't hear it. "Thank you." He nodded, standing. There was nothing more to say. Not now. Some things were better left unspoken, understood in the quiet spaces between words. As he walked toward the door, he glanced back once. Sam had already returned to their writing, pencil moving across the page with quiet determination. Elijah stepped outside. The air was crisp, the city moving on as it always had. But this time, he didn't feel separate from it. For the first time in years, he belonged. And that was enough. Elijah's journey reminds us that change is possible, even in the most unexpected moments. Sometimes the hardest battles aren't fought in the streets, but within ourselves. Have you ever faced a moment that reshaped your perspective? A time when a simple act of kindness changed everything? Share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear your stories. If this journey moved you, don't forget to like and subscribe for more powerful narratives that touch the heart. Every story matters, and yours might inspire someone today. Stay with us for more stories that remind us of our shared humanity.